We need to understand the physiology of sleep in order to increase our quality of sleep and our length of sleep. Very, very important for us to make sure that we are not pointing these little flashlights in our eyes when we're getting ready to go to bed, because they do have an effect. This is one of the consequences of modern society. The fact that we spend most of our time indoors, in the United States, the average American spends about 90% of their time indoors. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another session of Preventive Parenting. We are in session number 2, which deals with what I like to call health report card. How many of you have gotten a report card or a progress report or some type of notification of a good grade or a bad grade from your child? Okay. I know that I have at times. We homeschool, so I have direct access to all the grades. But I believe that there's another report card that we need to be monitoring. Now, why do we take a look at our children's scholastic grades? Well, we want to not only see what they're doing, but also make improvements, make assessments, and see how we can fix issues. It's the same thing with our children's health report cards. Now, last time we looked a little bit into longevity and the biblical ideals of how long people really could live on this earth, even after the fall. We saw that Adam lived to be almost 1,000 years old, and his close ancestors, very similar. Some even lived longer than Adam, such as Jared and Methuselah, and even Noah, who lived after the flood. What did all these men have in common? We're told that the line of Seth was a godly line. These men were God-fearing. They were, yes, as we learned in session 1, as men striving for the mastery, they were temperate in all things, but they also were keen students of the Word. These men were students of nature and nature's God. And they looked and learned from not only those around them who were perhaps coming before them and their habits, but they looked to even a greater source of insight and inspiration, and that was God. What had God said became their watchword, and that in turn became an amazing positive effect on their health. We can do the same. If we, in fact, go and analyze health in the beginning, we can look in the book of Genesis and find that God created a number of things that were for our instruction, for our admonition, such as the Genesis diet found in Genesis 1:29 and 3:18. But Genesis 2:1 through 2 is often overlooked as an instruction from God for us, for humanity. But nonetheless, it was. It reads, "And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done." The fact that God rested was a sign that not only he wanted to set apart a time and do this, but also that humanity would follow suit as well. Because you see, at this time, humanity was in direct communion with God. And if God rested, so did man. If God rested, so did Adam and Eve. Now, if that's the case, and rest is so important, is it important for us to be doing that today? Proper rest? And if that is so, we are in for a disease-ridden wake-up call in this country. Believe it or not, an estimated 60 million Americans have troubled sleep. And counter that with the fact that 90% of healing and growth takes place during sleep. And what we have is a very dangerous situation. We're not growing, perhaps, as children as we could, even though children still, even if they don't get enough sleep, God programmed children to grow. And I'm thankful for that. I'm 6'1". And if I had the unfortunate direct effects of my late nights sometimes when I was young, then I probably would be a very short stature. Well, we'll talk about growth hormone and what that means to both young and old in just a few moments. But I want to mention one more thing, and that is sleep is not just something that we do. It's not something that is kind of irrelevant and it's just a time of rest and everything just kind of dies down. And no, sleep is an activity, believe it or not. There's so many physiologic functions that take place during sleep that render it an essential activity. Now, yes, the brain does take time to rest, but we need to understand the physiology of sleep in order to increase our quality of sleep and our length of sleep to moderate times, or temperate times, I should say. So let's go into what I like to call the stages of sleep. We're going to go through 5 different stages, and I'm going to explain this to you so that you can be sleep experts by the end of this presentation. Stage 1 sleep, all of you know this, because it's light sleep. You're easily awakened, and you startle when you're awakened. Those of you adults, maybe some that this has even occurred to recently, you may have been driving down the road, and maybe it's getting a little bit late, and you start to doze off, but you startle right away. That ever happened to you? Guess what? You just went to sleep. You were in stage 1 sleep. Yet that stimuli basically triggered the brain to a level of alertness again, thankfully. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes people do fall asleep at the wheel. In fact, that's one of the big causes of motor vehicle accidents is that phenomenon. But that is stage 1 sleep. Now, if we want to fall asleep, that means we need to be in a quiet environment, or at least an environment that we're used to. Okay, so if you're used to sleeping at the train tracks, a perfect example of this, my first child, our oldest daughter, who was just a newborn when we moved into a house that was right next to the train tracks. Now, the first couple nights were a little bit odd, yes, but she was awake anyway. But believe it or not, that little baby could sleep through anything after that. Nothing would startle her out of, if she wanted to go to sleep, she'd go to sleep anywhere because she got used to that stimuli. But nonetheless, it is not a good habit to get into. It's good to be in a quiet environment when sleeping so that we can go from stage 1 to stage 2. What happens in stage 2? Well, eye movements kind of slow down or stop. Generally speaking, brain activity begins to slow down as well. And we'll see examples of this when we look at the electrical brain waves in just a few moments. Stage 3, if all goes well in stage 2, you'll get down to stage 3. It's the beginning of deep sleep. You have slower brain waves called delta waves that are starting to appear. And delta waves are similar to the brain activity that occurs during a coma, which is very low energy brain activity. This is basically the brain going into rest or hibernation stage. Why is that so important? Because the brain, yes, it is always active, and it has to be. There has to be at least some activity to keep your bodily functions going. But it does need a time where it can actually rest and recover. Now, during this time, we secrete a compound called growth hormone, which I had mentioned previous. During the onset of delta waves, that's when growth hormone levels increase. Stage 4 is the lowest of the brain wave activity stages, and this is where we see primarily delta waves appearing. If you are awakened during this period in the night, you're going to be very groggy, disoriented. Why? Because you have to kind of get back out of that coma, so to speak, of delta wave sleep. But if you are trying to improve your health with sleep, delta wave sleep is the place to be. It is where, as I mentioned, the growth hormone is secreted. Another hormone that is secreted is prolactin. And I know many of you men are thinking, well, prolactin, I don't produce that, do I? Yes, you do. Your brain does. And it's necessary for regenesis of neurons. You can actually regenerate neurons with prolactin secretion. And the growth hormone can help repair tissue. Now, keep in mind The brain has a time to be alert, and it does have that time to be asleep. This is what the brain waves look like in terms of activity. In the deep sleep, the delta waves you see they're very low energy, but the awake stages or the beta waves are very high energy. The alpha waves and theta waves are just a progression down there into the delta waves. And delta wave, just think of it as deep, deep sleep. The brain needs to recover and needs to slow down from all these electrical impulses that are constantly going through the neurons. But there's another stage of sleep. We call this stage 5, or REM sleep. Now, REM sleep is quite a bit different than delta wave sleep or stage 4 sleep. Because what happens with delta wave sleep is the exact opposite of what happens with REM sleep. You see, after about 2 to 3 hours of this delta wave sleep, your brain has had enough, and it says, hey, it's time for us to kind of reorganize and put things in place and connect new neural connections and networks whereby we can recall data faster, or who knows everything that goes on. But it's kind of a remodeling and restructuring phase for the brain. This is the time in which we dream, and many scientists believe that dreams have a lot to do with that, and the rapid eye movement. The REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep. A lot of scientists believe that is a time in which we really organize our thoughts and become more coherent in our ability to even bring up information from the reserves or the stores where we have placed them. Thankfully, most of us are paralyzed during REM sleep. Otherwise, we would start flailing and acting out our dreams, and some people do have that condition. Watch out for them if you're sleeping next to them. But increased heart rate occurs, increased blood pressure. Heart rate is just because the brain is becoming more active, and there's just a lot more stimuli. So we have a period in which there is very low stimuli for the brain, and then a period where it's almost as if we are awake and in full-blown activity. Now, I mentioned to you that sleep is an activity. Both the delta wave sleep, the slow wave sleep, and the REM sleep are both essential activities for good health. Now, what happens if you don't get enough? Well, you can develop all sorts of mental diseases, statistically speaking, because of lack of either delta wave or REM sleep. Thankfully, not all animals suffer this. Horses, for instance, if they don't get enough REM sleep, guess what happens? They fall over onto the ground, and they become basically paralyzed until they get enough REM sleep, and then they're back up on their legs. This is a very interesting phenomenon. I'll be driving down the road, and I'll look and I'll see one lone horse standing by his friend who's been knocked out by this need for REM sleep. A lot of people don't realize what it is, but that horse didn't get enough REM sleep. And so God has put it in their physiology that they will be forced to get enough REM sleep. But guess what? We're not forced. We are encouraged to get enough REM sleep. We're encouraged after God's example that he rested. We're encouraged also to rest. God will not force us in this aspect. Okay, here is a graphic representation of the stages of sleep and where they occur and the duration in which they occur on average in a given night. We see that the first priority of the brain and of the sleep cycle is to get into that low frequency, the delta wave sleep, okay? So the brain jumps down into delta wave sleep. Then you may have a little bit of REM sleep in there, but the majority of the later part of sleep, so meaning maybe into 4 or 5, 6, 7, even 8 hours of sleep, is going to be REM sleep, or not as slow wave. You may see some other waves in there as well, but not too many delta waves at that point. Now, I mentioned to you that growth hormone is secreted in pretty good quantities during the slow wave sleep. Now, children, thankfully, are automatically going to have growth hormone secretion, whether or not they have. Now, you may be able to optimize it with good delta wave sleep, but they are going to have this production and this secretion regardless. But as we age and we stop growing in stature, growth hormone is essential for us to be reconstructed. Studies have found that, and this is actually a direct quote, adults with growth hormone deficiency have a relative increase in fat mass and a relative decrease in muscle mass, and in many instances, decreased energy and quality of life. Who'd like that? No one wants that. No one wants that. So we need to make sure that we're getting that slow wave sleep. You might wonder, well, how? How can I do it? How can I get this slow wave sleep? How can I optimize my sleep? Some of you might not have even realized that that was a necessity. Well, I have a whole series entitled Supernatural Remedies, in which I look at natural things that can help us with various physiologic functions. One of my favorite herbs to use for sleep is an herb called valerian, and this has been studied extensively. It's been used in Europe for decades, if not centuries. And I say by and large, the consensus is that if it's going to be effective, it has to be done systematically. And that is kind of a way of describing successful sleep in general, because sleep needs to be cyclic. We have a body clock that it gets set how we live our lives, but it needs to be consistent because we have times for eating. The stomach will start to secrete more pepsin, which is an enzyme, and more acid around the times leading up to the normally prescribed meal times. And at the same time, we also have a sleep time that the brain recognizes. Now, some of this has to do with light exposure, which we'll get into in just a moment as well. But if we set a time for sleep, a bedtime, it's very important for us to try to keep that, whether we are young or old. But here's how valerian comes into play. One study revealed that in comparison with a placebo, this was a placebo-controlled study, it found that slow wave sleep latency, which basically is the amount of time it takes you to go from being awake to getting down into the delta waves. Remember I said it's a priority for the brain to jump down into delta wave sleep? Well, it turns out that valerian decreases that time. So you're more quickly getting the benefit of sleep as compared with a placebo. It's quite interesting. The results were actually quite startling. 21 minutes versus 13 minutes. So the valerian shaved off quite a bit of time that was not really that effective for promoting quality of sleep. Now here's another aspect. The total percentage of slow wave sleep. This is the time where we're getting the prolactin, our brain is resting, we're getting the growth hormone in larger quantities, was increased after long-term valerian treatment in comparison with the baseline. So pretty amazing results from a little plant. And you might wonder, well, what's the best way to take it? I've taken valerian supplements in a variety of ways. Some people like the tea. Tea doesn't always work well for children at bedtime, so there are other ways of doing it as well. But nonetheless, potentially a very helpful little herb there. But I'd like to go through more than just supplements, because there are a lot of supplements that claim to promote sleep and sleep quality. But there are lifestyle factors, meaning things that we can do and things that we can avoid doing that can have even greater impact upon quality of sleep than even a wonderful herb like valerian. I like to call this good sleep in 7 steps. Good sleep in 7 steps. Step number 1, wake up with the sun. Why is that so important? Well, you see, our body is on a clock. It is a 24-hour clock, and we have been programmed to be in light, periods of light, and also in periods of darkness. And God set up hormones and neurotransmitters that respond, and even organs like the pineal gland in the brain, to respond to this cycle of light and dark. And different hormones are secreted, different neurotransmitters are secreted based on the amount of light that is basically entering into our retinas. Now, that being said, I'm not advocating anyone go look at the sun. Just being outside in the sunlight is what I'm talking about. That's where the light is sweet and the pleasant thing it is for the eyes to behold the sun. Just being out. Something about sunlight exposure that improves the mood. You've heard of seasonal affective disorder, largely resulting from the changes in season and potentially the decrease in daylight hours as well. How can we remedy that? Well, try to be out there in the sunlight, especially early morning sunlight. Studies have found that going out in the early morning actually increases the absorption of infrared light, which is beneficial for a variety of health reasons. So early morning light, it's also not as harsh. It's a great time to be out in the sun, less risk of sunburn, and you get that benefit of the infrared light. Now, step number 2, eat a balanced diet rich in plant-based complex carbohydrates and tryptophan. What is tryptophan? It is an amino acid, and that means it's a building block of protein. So therefore, it's found in a lot of structures that have been made out of these building blocks. It's found in proteins. What proteins contain high amounts of tryptophan? According to nutritiondata.com, that includes supplements like spirulina. Foods like watercress, sesame seeds, soy milk, and tofu are also excellent sources. And soybeans, of course. Horseradish leaves. Now, that was an odd one for me. I've never seen that in the store. But pumpkin leaves, also never seen that in the store. So if you can have some of these others, but there are plenty of things to get tryptophan from. Even your whole grains are going to have adequate amounts of tryptophan. You don't have to necessarily eat this right before going to bed, but at least at some point during the day, you're eating tryptophan-rich foods. It's important. Why is that? Because tryptophan is converted into something called serotonin. Serotonin, you may have heard, is the antidepressive hormone. So if we have adequate levels of serotonin, then we feel better. It's the feel-good hormone. How do we get serotonin? Well, it's just by going out in that light and allowing the sunlight, just the ambient sunlight, to enter into our eyes. And it creates a reaction in the pineal gland that develops this neurotransmitter at this point of serotonin. So being out there will help us to feel better. Who would have thought going outside in the sunlight would help us get a good night's sleep? But notice I said serotonin is the daylight neurotransmitter, right? It's also the alertness promoting neurotransmitter. And you may ask, well, how does that help me? How does being alert help me to get a good night's sleep? Well, what happens is, as the darkness falls, the eyes can sense this, and we start to have a conversion from serotonin over to a neurotransmitter that you may have heard of before called melatonin. Melatonin is known as the nighttime health and healing promotion hormone or neurotransmitter. It's amazing in its effect. It's an antioxidant, it's an anti-cancer. It helps prime the immune response. So many other things. But it's essential for us to have serotonin in adequate amounts so that we can produce melatonin from that serotonin. So that's how going out in the sunlight and eating tryptophan-rich foods during the day help to promote a good night's sleep at night, or a quality sleep, I should say, at night. Now, there's a conversion complex that's needed in converting serotonin to melatonin, and it's called vitamin B6. Where can we find vitamin B6? Well, a very good source is bananas. There are other nuts and seeds and whole grains that have plenty of vitamin B6. You don't necessarily need to take a supplement for this. And it doesn't need to be taken right before bed. We're looking for at least sometime during the day that you're eating vitamin B6 rich foods so that you have adequate levels of that circulating, and it can be used in this conversion process. Now, there's something called the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier prevents certain things from going into the brain that shouldn't be there. Studies have found that when we eat proteins that are high in other amino acids as well as tryptophan, we don't absorb as much of the tryptophan. The key to getting the tryptophan in there is to have things like whole foods, plant-based tryptophan sources that are lower in other amino acids and higher in tryptophan, such as the ones that we mentioned earlier. Okay, let's go on to step 3. Find time during the day for moderate physical exercise. Why is this so important? Well, we know exercise is important for good health in general. We know it helps the circulation. We know it helps the mood. In fact, National Institutes of Mental Health say that exercise is one of the most powerful remedies against mild depression and anxiety, something that we can do that will help us get our minds off of our troubles, especially just a slow walk even in the evening. Wonderful way to wind down after a busy day. But that's not the only reason why it's important for us to exercise. You see, our bodies use a compound known as adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, in energy production. When ATP is used, there's a compound, the A in the ATP, that sometimes is released, and it can go make its way into the brain. That is the adenosine. Adenosine is the trigger for sleep. So when adenosine levels rise, it basically tells the brain, hey, you've been working very hard. You need to rest. This person needs to rest. Now, that can also be with intense mental work as well, and adenosine levels can rise. So whether you're working with your hands or working with your brain, you can trigger a sleepiness with adenosine. Now, step 4, leave your worries behind. Why is that so important? Studies have found that people who go to sleep anxious or angry or upset, and by the way, the Bible says don't let the sun go down in your anger, right? In Ephesians 4:26. Studies have found that increased levels of these anger hormones, adrenaline, can basically predict a very poor quality of sleep. Probably some of you can testify to that. If you go to sleep anxious or worried or even sad, you may not sleep very well or get quality sleep, maybe tossing and turning, they like to say. Okay, next step 5, avoid sleep-depriving substances. The big 3, alcohol, tobacco, and nicotine. And believe it or not, caffeine comes in there too. Caffeine as well. Let me show you a little study on brain activity. This is a really, really good graph. I think it was probably based on a study that showed the proper designations of the stages of sleep at the various times of sleep. One thing it didn't show is right there when you are dipping down from wakefulness to stage 1, a very interesting phenomenon occurs. And that is that you go into a little blip of REM sleep. And you may not even catch it. But if you think about it as you're drifting off to sleep tonight, you probably will wake yourself up. The first time I realized this, I read about it, and I went to sleep, I was thinking, I'm going to watch for this to happen. Sure enough, there it was, a little dream, and then I was off to sleep. That's what happens. I think it's so important. And why would that be necessary? Well, if we look at the hypothesis that dreaming or REM sleep is a time of storage of what has been utilized during the day, my belief is when we go to sleep, we have things on our mind. And have you ever noticed you can remember oftentimes those things, especially if you say, I need to remember this when I wake up. Well, there it is. I remembered it. My belief, my hypothesis, I haven't been able to prove this, but just in my experience, is that little blip of dream, of REM sleep, is you storing the things that were on your mind right when you went to sleep. How do you begin your sleep cycle? Do you begin with the Word of God, or do you lay down with your troubles? Because rest assured, those troubles are going to be on your mind when you wake up, right? Those troubles will still be there, thanks to this little blip of REM. But if we go to sleep putting our trust in God and in His Word, I believe we wake up feeling much more refreshed, don't you? Let's talk about alcohol and its specific effects on the brain waves that we see right here. Studies have found that alcohol robs the body of both REM and deep sleep. It's little wonder that people with alcoholism suffer a lot of mental illness because the brain is neither resting nor sorting things out correctly. And so you just get this mediocre quality of sleep, even if you sleep for the proper duration, just poor quality of sleep that doesn't really regenerate the neurons, doesn't really regenerate the body, doesn't prime the immune system as it should. And that is one of the detrimental effects of alcohol use. Next up, caffeine. What does caffeine do? Caffeine is a stimulant. Therefore, it stimulates the body, it stimulates the nervous system. And when we take caffeine during the day, studies have found that even 2 cups of coffee in the morning, which is kind of the standard for most Americans at least, can affect sleep at night. That's quite a time. That 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours after can still affect sleep. And what will it do? If you have stimulation of the neurons, then you are robbed of especially this sleep right here, the deep sleep, the delta wave sleep, which is essential for the brain's resting and recovering. And we could be robbing our brain of that. Now, here's something that I don't have on my slides, but I do want to mention, especially those of you who may be traveling tonight or sometime soon. A lot of individuals will take caffeine as a way of stimulating their brain so that they can drive a little bit further at night, maybe a lot further even, because it relieves that sleepiness. The reason why it does that is it blocks the receptors whereby adenosine, remember the compound that's produced during work or mental work, it blocks the receptors of adenosine so that there's no communication, and the body cannot tell the brain, hey, you're tired, you're tired. But that is still building up. The adenosine is still building up and building up and building up. Well, imagine this scenario. I'm driving down the road. I start to feel tired. In fact, I go into stage 1 sleep and I startle myself. And I think, wow, I'm getting really tired. I'm going to go pull over and I'm going to get a coffee, or I'm going to get 3 coffees, okay? Because I really need to stay awake. And so I go get those beverages, get back on the road, and here I am driving. Guess what's going on? The adenosine is still crying out. The blockade is happening at the receptors, but adenosine levels are increasing and increasing and increasing. And here is a well-studied reference phenomenon that occurs. All of a sudden, the caffeine wears off. It stops blocking the adenosine receptors. And the adenosine charges into those receptors, and guess what? There's no startle reflex. You go straight to sleep. And that's a very dangerous thing if you're on the road driving. So my advice to anyone who's ever thought about taking caffeine to stay awake, and by the way, I've driven, I do public health education. I've driven all over the country, hundreds of thousands of miles of driving. And that's not an exaggeration. But I've never once, at least since I've learned about this, never once taken caffeine to stay awake. You know what I do? I go to sleep. I pull off the road, take a little nap maybe, go to a hotel room, because it's much safer than gambling with your life and your family's lives. Tobacco, how does that affect the brain waves here? Tobacco users usually miss out on the deeper sleep because of nicotine withdrawal. Nicotine withdrawal usually hits in about 2 hours after the last usage, because it's cleared very quickly. So if I am having a nicotine impulse, this nicotine craving, it's a stimulatory response, and it will startle me and awaken me out of deep sleep. So much so that I may miss that second rendition of deep sleep right there. Okay, some medications have been found to interfere with sleep. Antidepressants have been found to decrease levels of REM sleep. And here's one that a lot of us are guilty of, and that is eating a large meal before going to bed. I don't know about you, but if I eat a large meal before going to bed, I just don't sleep well at all. And I have bad dreams, just weird dreams even. And that is a sign that something is going on with the sleep cycle. Something is not right. And the reason why is simply because the stomach was supposed to be resting during that time. The brain did not want to have to say, hey, stomach, let's make sure that once you get all that food in there, that we're going to start secreting more pepsin. We're going to start evacuating some of that water. We're going to start pulsing and churning. And we're going to start putting some of that out into the small intestine. And we're going to start sampling some of that to make sure it's properly broken down and digested by the small intestine. And we're going to tell the stomach, no, keep going, keep working, keep working, keep working. All these processes have to be run by the brain, okay? They're not running by themselves. And so the brain has to stay awake. It can't go down into deep sleep. So you may totally miss out on delta wave sleep just because of the habit of eating the last meal of the day as a very, very heavy meal. And that seems to be the trend of society. You know, it used to be, in an agrarian society, you needed all that energy up front and a good hearty breakfast to go out and work the land. And you weren't so much hungry when you're coming back in. You just kind of wanted to go to sleep, so you ate very light. And there's an old adage that says, breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and supper like a pauper, or maybe not even at all. It's not essential for everyone to have a supper. This is what it looks like if we do the opposite. If we have that breakfast like a pauper and we have that supper like a king, we get this lack of slow wave sleep, frequent awakenings. We're tossing and turning during the night. And what this brings about is disease, is chronic disease. If sleep goes on like this, as we see here depicted in the bottom graph, we will come down with some type of chronic disease. We may even come down with some type of chronic mental disease as well. That regular bedtime is essential. Regularity is key. They did some studies a while back on nurses and found that as nurses work different shifts, so maybe they worked a night shift on Monday and they worked a morning shift on Tuesday and they worked a midday shift on Wednesday and they just kind of went back and forth. Well, their sleep cycle was all mixed up and they developed all sorts of chronic diseases because of it. There's a direct link between irregularity in sleeping times and chronic disease. Regularity is key, so try to have that established bedtime. Early bedtime would be best. And you may be a shift worker. You may have to go to sleep when it's light out. But what can we do? We can take measures to make sure that we're regular in those times. Another thing we have to do if we are out in the sun and then we have to go straight to bed is try to wind down. And I don't mean by that sitting in your bed looking at your phone. And I'm guilty of that. I'm pointing the fingers at myself. Why is that? Because studies have found that when we look at electronic devices, not only just being out in the bright sun, if we had to go to sleep during the day, but for most people, you sleep at night. Don't need to worry about that too much. But you may need to be concerned about your usage of electronic devices with screens during the hours leading up to bedtime. Now, they do have apps that apparently reduce the amount of blue light that's secreted, or that apparently reduce the amount of blue light that is shown on the screen. But other studies have found that has very little impact. There's still enough blue light coming through that screen that it's causing issues with sleep. What does that blue light do? It increases serotonin production. It makes you alert. And that is good in its proper time, but it's not good when trying to go to bed. One study found participants reading a light-emitting ebook took longer to fall asleep and had reduced evening sleepiness, reduced melatonin secretion, later timing of their circadian clock, and reduced next morning alertness than when reading a printed book. So very, very important for us to make sure that we are not pointing these little flashlights in our eyes when we're getting ready to go to bed, because they do have an effect. This is one of the consequences of modern society, and we're still scientifically trying to keep up with these advances. But one thing that we have established is it is not healthy for us to be looking at these devices when going to bed. Some of you may be wondering, well, what about my child? How much sleep do they need? Well, it actually varies, because a newborn needs almost 24 hours of sleep. They need to sleep as much as they can. But once you start getting a little bit older, they do have some recognized variable designations of sleep. And I say that because not everyone needs the same amount of sleep. Studies have found that the general consensus is for adults, it's somewhere between 7 and 8 is the ideal, maybe even up to 8.5. But teens need a little bit more, 8 to 10 perhaps. Preschoolers need more. Toddlers need more. And as you can see, infants, 4 to 12 months need potentially even 12 to 16 hours of sleep. And their parents probably think they even need more than that after staying awake with them. And by the way, it seems that the youngsters, now I have 6 children, not all of them have chosen this. We even got a onesie for one of our children that said, siesta during the day, fiesta at night. And, sometimes that happens, but we have to adapt. And as new parents, you will learn quickly how to adapt and how to make sure that you get your proper sleep, because you really feel it. When you're forced into that situation, and especially as you age, as you get older, you realize when you lose sleep, it really affects us cognitively and physically. Other studies have found that when we lack the proper amount of sleep, we have a tremendous increase in the amount of inflammatory compounds. And these inflammatory compounds can worsen conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or even osteoarthritis. They can compound any type of inflammatory disorder. So it's essential for us to get this good sleep if we want to stave away those aches and pains. You may be wondering, though, is it possible to get too much sleep? And yes, it is. Studies have found that as we go over that sweet spot, at least with adults, and we get into 9 or 10 hours of sleep, the risk of disease starts to increase. There's one study that found people that slept over 8 hours a night had more than 200% increased risk of developing diabetes compared with those who slept 7 hours a night. Okay? Remember, that's 8 and over. Some of those people slept much more than 8 hours. But adults need a general amount. And as I said before, it's not just one designation. It's not just you need 8 hours of sleep. You may need 7. You may need 8.5. But you probably don't need over 9. Once we start to get that, the brain is in this process. It says, hey, it's time to awaken. It's alert. Your blood pressure's going up. Heart rate's going up. Respiratory rate's going up. But you're not going up. So what happens? That causes a stress on the body. It can cause an increased risk of chronic disease. However, it is essential for us to get enough. Another study found that sleep and diabetes had a direct correlation among adults. Those that slept 6 or fewer hours at night had a 95% increased risk for developing type 2 diabetes. 95% increased risk. Keep in mind, that risk was greater for people who slept too much. So the concept of temperance here is really important. What is temperance again? The definition of temperance, if we could extrapolate from all the Bible passages, is the moderate use of that which is good and the total abstinence of those things which are harmful. That's temperance. So even sleep, even though it is a good thing, needs to be done in its proper sphere of time. Here's another study that looked at sleep quality. Not just sleep duration is important. It's also important to have good quality sleep, which we mentioned previously. One study from Germany found that over a period of 10 years, men who had troubled sleep had a 60% increased risk of developing diabetes. Women who had troubled sleep had a 98% greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes compared to those who slept well during the night. So it's not enough just to get that length of sleep that we need, but also that quality of sleep as well. Keep in mind that obesity is a sure predictor of the development in most cases of diabetes. 90% of type 2 diabetics are also obese. It's a comorbidity. We probably should say that diabetes is a comorbidity of obesity because obesity comes first. Now, what do you think happens with childhood obesity? Remember from session 1, we realized the rates are increasing tremendously in the United States and in the Western world. Why? Because we've adopted a lifestyle that is not conducive to good health in many cases. And what we can expect to see is that levels of diabetes, juvenile diabetes, are going up. They're skyrocketing as well. Levels of heart disease, because whenever you have diabetes, you also have increased risk of heart disease. All of these chronic diseases. And these diseases, as we mentioned from session 1, of the Egyptians, they don't have to be there. God says, if you will diligently hearken unto my words, I will not put those diseases of the Egyptians upon you. And so God gives us the admonition that he wants us to prosper and be in health, even as our soul prospers. As we read his word, we find admonition there that tells us how to be healthy, how to live our lives. It's the instruction manual, not just for things spiritual, but things physical as well. Let's go on to another chronic disease, cancer. Studies have found that losing 3 or more hours of sleep at night greatly increases the risk of cancer. Why is that? Well, some postulate that it's because of the immune function that's decreased. Now, keep in mind you have more inflammatory compounds that are secreted when you lose 3 or more hours of sleep, but you also have less proper function of the immune system. It's almost like as if the immune system is going to battle, but is not fighting the right foes. Just doesn't know how to operate under those suboptimal conditions that characterize poor quality sleep. Another study looking at nurses found that those who slept less than 5 hours a night had a 39% increased risk of developing heart disease. And conversely, those who slept too much, over 9 hours, had a 37% increase in risk. But our physical body is not the only thing that is harmed with poor sleep or poor sleep quality. We also find issues with mental health, as we mentioned before. Inadequate sleep has been found to increase depression risk, and many of our young people, many children, are becoming depressed. Could it be linked to the fact that maybe they're not sleeping enough? Maybe they're not getting good quality sleep. Maybe they're going to sleep with an iPad in hand or e-reader or something that's emitting light. Maybe they're having a soda pop with caffeine in it, but right before going to bed. Whatever it may be, any of these things will decrease their quality of sleep and potentially increase risk of mental illness. And conversely as well, oversleeping also increases this paradigm of mental illness. Now, title for the presentation today was Health Report Card. And I want to tell you that I had to give you a little background to all of this before I tell you how to read your child's health report card. In fact, I'm going to give you your child's health report card. Furthermore, you already have it. So I'm just going to tell you how to read it, okay? This is how you read it. One study found that children going to bed after 9 p.m. were the most at risk for developing diabetes and temperament issues, okay? Diabetes and temperament issues. So physical infirmity and mental health impairment as well. What is that? Children going to bed after 9 p.m. Now, I have a slogan that I've coined over the years in giving these presentations. I like to say this, and I try to live by this adage. I have not always been as I should, and I do see the effects on my children's health report cards. But this is it. In bed before 9, the less they will whine, and the more they will be fine. Okay? In bed before 9, the less they will whine, and the more they will be fine. So if you have got that down, you already are way ahead of your children's peers in promoting that passing grade on their health report card. There may be another aspect that you have overlooked. I know I oftentimes overlook it myself, even in my own health report card. And that is the one of what are we breathing at night? Or do we crack the window open and let a little bit of fresh air in? I had the privilege last night of sleeping with a window cracked, and it was in a safe place. I didn't feel like it was a danger to me to do so. And I woke up feeling so refreshed and invigorated, just that fresh air coming into the room. It turns out that when we exhale, we secrete inflammatory compounds. They're called prostaglandins. We secrete them. We also take in oxygen and we give out CO2. CO2 is a waste molecule. It is basically burnt oxygen. Okay, and we're getting rid of it. It's been utilized to generate energy. We get rid of it and we send it outside. The trees take it and they give us oxygen back in return. They take that carbon. That's a blessing that God has created this cycle for us. But what happens if we just shut in our own air? And we just keep rebreathing the CO2. We keep rebreathing the inflammatory compounds. Well, serotonin levels actually start to go up, and inflammation starts to go up in the body. A lot of allergies are triggered by environmental aspects. Could be inside, but a lot of times they're outside. But if we're cooped up in the same room with something that's potentially causing us allergy, which we'll get to the primary allergenic substance in indoor air in just a moment, we're going to cause an exacerbation of allergic responses. In Western countries, 40 million children suffer from allergies, it's estimated. And by age 6, about 42% of children in general develop some type of allergic rhinitis, stuffy nose related to allergy. Why do I bring this up? Because this is part of the child's health report card. You see, if you go in to check on your child and they're snoring loudly, that is a bad sign. One study found that poor sleep due to snoring increased hyperactivity by 140%, increased inattentive behavior by 300%, increased daytime tiredness, that's kind of a given, by 610%, increased sleepiness by 380%. Now listen to this. Remember in the report card it says plays well with others? I hope all of you got good grades on that recently, if you are in school. Well, bad conduct increases by 180% if your child has been snoring. Emotional problems up by 450% if your child has been snoring. So it's so important for us to provide an environment that is non-allergenic to our children. And how do we do that? Well, there are a number of ways that we can help to reduce the severity of environmental allergens, and we'll talk about that when we talk about exercise and a few other things. But just providing clean air at night is so very essential. Clean air. And how do we get that? We could run a little filtration device if we wanted to. That's fine. But letting that outdoor air go out and the indoor air come in is really the essential component. So the EPA estimates that indoor air is 3 to 5 times more polluted than outdoor air. So we think of pollution, well, that's outside, but in reality, indoor air is where most of the pollution is that we're exposed to. Not only that, the fact that we spend most of our time indoors, in the United States, the average American spends about 90% of their time indoors. And unfortunately, that includes children in this day and age. It used to be children would just be outside, free as lambs, But now they're stuck in classrooms all day. Schools cancel recess. They keep them inside. They're playing video games maybe all day instead of going outside and playing. And they're just rebreathing this bad air and also missing out on the exercise and the sunlight and the other aspects of being outside and the many blessings of being outside. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we could send our children outside. And for many of us, it would even benefit us to join our children outside because it's just so very important. And because we can get that fresh air. While we're outside, open the windows, let those pollutants out. And when we come back in, we're going to be refreshed and breathing that refreshing air. I believe that God wants us to breathe in that breath of life that he gave in the beginning. Remember health in the beginning? God breathed into Adam the breath of life and he became a living being. God wants to breathe that air into us. He created the air for us. He created the pure air for us, I should say. Man has defiled it through various inventions and innovations even. But God wants us to breathe pure. He wants us to live pure. And by living pure, we can have better quality sleep. How do we live pure? It's by, like those mighty men that lived before the flood, by searching out God's will and by being men of action in doing what God had instructed them to do. Why did God rest in the beginning? Once again, Isaiah 40:28. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. Why did he rest? He didn't need to do it because of his own tiredness. He does not grow tired. He did it because he loves us, because he wants to set an example so that we can follow after him. And believe it or not, that's how it is with everything in life. God has set an example through Jesus Christ. You know, before we would come in the presence of the Father, the almighty, invisible, immortal, you know, and we can read about him through the word, what is revealed. But when he was manifest in the flesh through Jesus Christ, we see that is who I want to follow. That is who sets the standard for my health report card. Not only for my health report card, but for my spiritual report card. God wants us. He invites us today to come apart and to rest in him, to come apart and to experience this better health, this better paradigm of life. 3 John 2, we have the admonition, beloved, I wish above all things thou would prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospers. He wants us to be in health mentally, physically, and spiritually. And truly, it's only then, and this is the secret here, the big reveal. It's only then that we can say with the psalmist, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. It's only when we come to Christ that we can put the anxieties away. It's only when we come to Christ that we can put the addictive substances away that are maybe robbing us from delta wave sleep or deranging our REM sleep. It's only when we come to Christ that we can find consolation through chronic illness and maybe even resolution and reversal, because all things are possible in Christ. And as I read in Matthew 9:35, there was no disease that Christ could not touch with his healing. How many of you want a better grade today? How many of you want to say to Christ, please come and change my mark? I want a better grade in this category. I want a better grade in my spiritual walk. I want a better grade in my mental fortitude, my mental focus. I want a better grade in my lifestyle habits. Guess what? Christ has promised that when we call, he's going to come. And he's going to be that good teacher, that good tutor. And he's going to say, son, daughter, here's your grade. And by my strength, you have passed the course. You've passed the course today. How many of you want that?